Dawn breaks early on 22nd June 1941. Along the German-Soviet frontier, the eastern sky glows a pale, deceptive orange, the kind of quiet summer light that should belong to farmers and field workers. Instead, that horizon is lined with steel. Engines rumble in low, steady waves, exhaust fumes hanging over endless columns of panzers, trucks, motorcycles, and horse-drawn wagons. You can almost smell the mix of fuel and dust as the Wehrmacht ES spearheads wait for the signal to move. In command posts set up in schoolhouses and farmsteads, officers lean over maps striped with thick blue arrows driving deep into Soviet territory, confident that within weeks the Red Army will be shattered and the war in the east all but won. At 03:15, artillery answers the dawn. The still air explodes into concussion and fire as thousands of guns open up almost at once, their flashes strobing the low clouds. Across the border, Soviet positions are ripped apart before many soldiers are even fully awake. Then, over the barrage, comes a new sound, the rising drone of engines overhead. Luftwaffe bombers and fighters sweep east. Black silhouettes against the brightening sky, heading for airfields and rail junctions. From the German side of the line, you can picture men shading their eyes, watching their own aircraft disappear into the glare, and believing that this is the beginning of a short, decisive campaign. They've seen this pattern before in Poland, in France, in the Balkans. The script seems familiar. On the roads behind the guns, armoured columns begin to roll. Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks lead the way, their crews pressed into the cramped interiors, radios crackling in their ears, vision slits framing the world as a narrow strip of dusty road and fleeing countryside. They have drilled for this for months. They know their gun calibers, armor thicknesses, and engagement ranges. Against the light Soviet tanks and outdated designs they expect to face, the German officers are sure their weapons are more than enough. Staff briefings have reassured them. The Red Army is clumsy, poorly led, still reeling from Stalin's purges. We just have to push, one battalion commander tells his men, and they will break. At first, the war seems to obey those expectations. Forward units report shattered Soviet border posts, abandoned artillery, and long columns of prisoners herded west with dazed faces and dust-caked uniforms. Reconnaissance aircraft radio back photographs showing burning airfields littered with wrecked Soviet planes. In staff tents and converted village halls, situation reports are read out with a calm, almost clinical pride. Kilometers advanced, bridges seized, enemy divisions disorganized or destroyed. You can hear the self-assurance in the voices, the quiet assumption that German planning, discipline, and technology are doing exactly what they were designed to do. But even in the first days, tiny cracks appear in the image of effortless victory. A panzer regiment reports unexpected resistance near a forested ridge. An infantry division notes significant armor presence that doesn't match pre-war intelligence. In the chaos of the advance, these details are easy to miss, just lines in teleprinter messages rattling through higher headquarters. Somewhere near the front, a company signals that they have encountered new enemy tanks that are larger than expected. The description is vague: sloped sides, unusual silhouette, moving fast even across soft ground. The report is filed, passed on, and then buried under the flood of other news. For the men at the sharp end, though, something feels different. Anti-tank crews with their familiar 3.7 cm guns, the door knockers that had done their work well enough in Poland and France, notice strange stories filtering down the line. Another battery claims they needed multiple hits to stop a Soviet tank. A neighboring unit insists they saw shells ricochet at close range. Around the gun pits at night, when the firing dies down and only the crackle of campfires and distant explosions remain, these tales are traded with a mixture of skepticism and unease. Are these just nerves, exaggerations? Or is there really something out there that doesn't behave like the tanks they know? In frontline command posts, the tone of some messages changes subtly. One regimental diary notes losses to unidentified heavy tanks. A divisional report complains that visibility and terrain are making it hard to classify all enemy vehicles correctly. The official summaries still sound confident, but between the lines you can sense a growing curiosity, even irritation, that the enemy isn't fitting into pre-war categories as neatly as expected. Whenever an officer asks what exactly these new tanks are, The answer is usually the same. Intelligence is looking into it. More data is needed. For now, press on. The men who crew the German guns and tanks do not yet know the name T-34. To most of them, armor is armor, a target to be ranged, bracketed, and destroyed. They trust their training and their equipment, the solid feel of a shell as it slides into the breech, the familiar recoil of the gun. When they imagine the battles still to come, they picture the same duels they fought in the West, just on a larger scale. The idea that there could be a machine out there that bends the rules, faster over mud, harder to kill from the front, built for a different kind of war, has not yet taken hold. On the Soviet side, the picture is even more chaotic. Many units are caught in motion, some half mobilized, some still receiving equipment. In the confusion of retreat and counterattack, new tanks are thrown into combat piecemeal, often without proper coordination or air cover. Even where T-34s are present, they may be scattered across different brigades, their crews inexperienced, their support fragile. From the German vantage point, this fragmentation helps keep the full significance of the new design hidden. A few appear here, a few there, never yet in the kind of mass that would force everyone to sit up and take notice. To a staff officer looking at a map, they are simply anomalies in a larger picture of advance and encirclement, yet the battlefield is already collecting quiet evidence. On dusty roadsides and in fields of trampled wheat, some wrecked German tanks and gun positions tell a slightly different story than the reports suggest. A knocked-out panzer sits with a neat hole in its side, testimony to a gun more powerful than expected at that range. An anti-tank position has its shield bent and splintered, its crew wiped out by a single high-explosive shell. The survivors who walk past these scenes feel a chill that the official bulletins do not mention. You can imagine one of them bending to pick up a fragment of unfamiliar shell casing, turning it over in his hand, wondering what kind of weapon fired it. Back at higher headquarters, the tempo of planning meetings remains brisk. Army group commanders talk in terms of days and weeks, of rivers to be crossed, cities to be taken, Soviet forces to be encircled. They speak of tonnages, marching speeds, fuel stocks, and train schedules. When the question of Soviet armor arises, reference is made to known models, to pre-war intelligence estimates, to tables of penetration and armor thickness carefully studied before the campaign. If strange reports from the front do arrive, they are noted, but not yet allowed to redefine the whole picture. After all, no war goes exactly according to plan. Some friction is to be expected. But in a few forward command dugouts, a different kind of conversation is beginning. Officers who have seen these new tanks, or at least the aftermath of their actions, start to ask harder questions. Why did a standard gun fail at such close range? Why did that particular Soviet unit seem so hard to stop? And what happens if there are more of these machines than anyone has guessed? There are no clear answers yet, only radio messages, fragments of testimony, and rare glimpses of unfamiliar silhouettes moving through smoke and dust. As the first week of the invasion draws to a close, the German offensive is still driving deep into Soviet territory. Towns have fallen, rivers have been crossed, and tens of thousands of prisoners are already on the march to the rear. On the surface, the campaign looks like another triumph of planning and mechanized warfare. Yet scattered along hundreds of kilometers of front are men who have seen something that doesn't fit. They might not know its name. They might not agree on every detail. But they are sure of one thing. Somewhere out there, beyond the next tree line or over the next ridge, there is a Soviet tank that can take everything they throw at it and keep coming. Soon, to understand why that machine exists at all, the story will have to leave the dust of the battlefield and step back in time. To the workshops, test grounds, and design bureaus where the idea of a different kind of tank was born. Long before German troops crossed the Soviet border in 1941, the story of the T-34 begins in workshops that smell of hot oil and cut steel. In the early 1930s, the Soviet Union is still trying to drag itself into the industrial age at breakneck speed. Tractor factories and tank plants are rising out of fields and empty lots, their brick walls stained with coal smoke, their assembly halls echoing with the clang of hammers and the hiss of welding torches. In Kharkov, in the Ukrainian SSR, one such plant, Kharkov Locomotive Factory, later known as Factory No. 183, becomes the crucible for a new kind of tank. Here, engineers and workers labor under portraits of Stalin and banners demanding higher output, knowing that failure is not just a professional risk, but potentially a fatal one. The men at the center of this effort, figures like Mikhail Koshkin and Alexander Morozov, are not designing for comfort or elegance. They are designing for survival in a war they believe is inevitable. On their drafting tables, they sketch answers to hard questions. How do you build a tank that can fight in knee-deep spring mud, in 30-degree winters, across thousands of kilometers of bad roads or no roads at all? How do you give it enough armor to resist enemy fire without making it so heavy it sinks into the earth? How do you arm it strongly enough to kill whatever the enemy fields next, not just what he has today? Every line on the blueprint is a compromise between weight, protection, firepower, and speed. At first, the Soviets follow a familiar path. They experiment with fast BT-series tanks based on foreign designs, machines that race across test ranges on wheels and tracks, impressive on firm ground but fragile in real battlefield conditions. You can picture one of these early prototypes roaring across a frozen plain during trials, its engines screaming, snow spraying from its tracks, only to shudder and stall when a gearbox fails or a suspension arm cracks. Reports pile up: good speed, poor reliability, impressive on paper, vulnerable in practice. The lessons from conflicts like the Spanish Civil War and the battles at Khalkhin against the Japanese start to sink in. Lightly armored vehicles die quickly under modern anti-tank guns and aircraft. Mobility alone is not enough. In Kharkov's design bureaus, the answer that slowly emerges is radical for its time. A medium tank with thick, sloped armor, wide tracks, and a powerful 76.2mm gun. Instead of bolting flat plates together like many foreign designs, Soviet engineers angle the armor so that incoming shells have to chew through more metal and are more likely to deflect. Instead of narrow tracks that dig into soft ground, they opt for broad ones that spread the weight, letting the tank float better over mud and snow. You can almost see the chalk marks on the factory floor, where engineers have traced the outline of a proposed hull, arguing over every degree of slope and every centimeter of clearance. The road to that design is anything but smooth. Prototypes like the A-20 and A-32 are built and tested under brutal conditions. Engines are run at full throttle for hours, then torn down to measure wear. And tanks are driven up steep, rutted hills until something breaks, then driven again once repairs are made. In winter tests, metal becomes brittle, oil thickens, crews fight freezing air that slices through gaps in armor plates. Test drivers squint through frosted vision slits, fingers numb on the controls, as officers with clipboards watch from the roadside, collars turned up against the wind. Every failure is logged, every breakdown another lesson paid for in time, material, and sometimes lives. Over all of this hangs the pressure of Soviet politics. The purges of the late 1930s have swept through the Red Army and the defense industry, leaving everyone keenly aware that being associated with a wrong design can be dangerous. Some accounts describe Koshkin personally campaigning to protect the new tank project, insisting that the future of Soviet armored forces depends on it. When higher authorities remain skeptical, he reportedly orders a dramatic demonstration. A long-distance drive of prototypes from Kharkov to Moscow and back in the dead of winter. You can imagine the convoy crawling along icy roads, engines roaring in the cold, crews huddled in their padded uniforms as snowflakes whip past the hull. Every kilometer completed is a wordless argument in favor of the new tank. By 1940, the concept has hardened into reality. The tank, now known as the T-34, takes shape on the factory floor. Plates of rolled armor are cut, bent, and welded into that distinctive angular hull. Turrets are cast and machined, ready to receive the 76.2mm gun that will give the vehicle its punch. Diesel engines, unusual at the time for tanks, are assembled and tested, their clatter echoing through test bays. The air in the plant is thick with smoke and metal dust. You can almost feel the heat radiating from the furnaces as workers in heavy overalls guide glowing steel under presses and into molds. Compared to German designs, the T-34 looks crude in some respects. Its interior is cramped and noisy. Optics and radios are often of uneven quality, especially in the first production runs. Welding can be rough, surfaces unfinished. A German engineer might have frowned at such imperfections, but the Soviets are designing for different priorities. They accept rough edges in exchange for armor and firepower. They accept discomfort for the crew in exchange for a hull that is simpler to manufacture in huge numbers. They are not chasing perfection on the drawing board. They are chasing a machine that can be built by the thousands, survive in the worst conditions on Earth, and kill whatever it meets at typical combat ranges. Doctrine shapes the tank as much as steel does. Soviet planners do not see the T-34 as a delicate breakthrough weapon to be pampered and kept in reserve. They imagine waves of these machines rolling across open terrain, supporting infantry, exploiting breakthroughs, and grinding down the enemy through relentless pressure. Training pamphlets talk about aggressive maneuver, about closing the distance quickly, about not hesitating when under fire. In that vision, a tank must be able to take punishment and keep moving. Sloped armor, wide tracks, and a strong gun are not luxuries. They are the core of survival. By some accounts, not everyone in the Red Army is immediately convinced. There are officers who prefer heavier, more cumbersome designs like the KV series, and others who worry about production complexities and reliability issues. Spare parts are hard to standardize, supply lines are fragile, and the Soviet industrial system is already straining to meet ambitious quotas. But as the international situation grows darker, with the fall of France, the Battle of Britain, and the looming threat of conflict with Germany, pressure builds to push the T-34 into full production. Factories are retooled, workers retrained, and soon the first batches of tanks are rumbling out of the gates, their paint barely dry. On proving grounds outside Moscow and deeper inside the Soviet Union, crews climb into these new machines for training. The smell of fresh paint and warm diesel fills the interior as engines turn over with a heavy, throaty rumble. Drivers test the responsiveness of the steering, feeling how the wide tracks bite into soft ground. Gunners practice laying the 76.2mm gun onto plywood silhouettes, adjusting for range and elevation. Commanders, often with limited experience, try to make sense of new tactics and new technology at the same time. There are breakdowns, misunderstandings, accidents. No army adopts a new weapon without friction. What sets the T-34 apart, even at this early stage, is not that it is flawless, but that it is built around a brutally realistic understanding of the war the Soviets expect to fight. They assume the enemy will hit them hard and fast. They assume they will be pushed back, forced to fight in mud, snow, and burning cities. They assume they will have to endure heavy losses and still keep producing tanks. So they build a machine that can be welded together in rough field factories, repaired with basic tools, and driven by men who may have had only a few weeks to learn the controls. It is not pretty, it is not comfortable, but it is designed to endure. As the summer of 1941 approaches, T-34s are still only a fraction of the Red Army's tank force. Many units are equipped with older models, T-26, BT tanks, and assorted obsolete designs. The new machines are scattered across a handful of mechanized corps, not yet concentrated, their crews not fully trained, their logistics not fully in place. On paper, they are a glimpse of the future. In reality, they are a work in progress, thrown into a storm sooner than anyone had planned. On 22nd June, when the thunder of Barbarossa rolls over the border, some of these T-34s are parked under camouflage nets. Others sit in depots awaiting fuel, ammunition, or spare parts. A few are already on the move, heading toward threatened sectors as desperate Soviet orders try to form coherent defenses out of chaos. Engines cough to life, tracks begin to turn, exhaust fumes swirl into the morning air. Crews adjust straps on their padded helmets, slam hatches shut, and feel the vibration of the hull under their boots. They do not know that on the other side of the front, German tankers and gunners still believe they are facing a familiar enemy, one whose machines will burn under their standard guns, as they always have. Very soon, on dusty roads and in fields choked with smoke, these two worlds will collide. And when they do, men who trusted their weapons will watch their shells bounce away from a tank built for a different war. The morning air is already warm when the German gun crew hears the first rumble. It is late June 1941. somewhere along a narrow road cutting through fields and patches of birch forest in western Ukraine. Dust hangs over the landscape, stirred up by days of continuous movement. Columns of infantry, horse-drawn wagons, tanks, and trucks all grinding eastward. The crew of a 3.7 mm Pak 36 anti-tank gun waits in a shallow dug-in position beside the road, their field-grey uniforms streaked with sweat and dirt. They have been told Soviet armor is in the area. For them, that means more of the light tanks they have already knocked out in Poland and France. Targets they know, targets their gun can kill. The first Soviet vehicles appear as distant specks, shimmering in the heat haze. Through his sight, the gunner squints, adjusting the focus, calling out ranges and bearing to his loader. A few T-26s or BT tanks, they can't tell exactly, which is good enough. Entfernung 700, distance 700. The barrel swings, the traverse wheel squeaks faintly beneath his gloved hand. Then behind the familiar shapes, something else materializes out of the dust. Larger, with a low, sloping front, and wide tracks that bite into the earth. The outline doesn't match the mental catalogue he built from training manuals and intelligence briefings. He hesitates for a heartbeat, then forces it down. Bigger target, same job. Orders snap out. Feuer frei! The first round leaps from the barrel with a sharp crack, the recoil jarring the whole carriage backward. You can almost feel the shock travel through the ground, the burnt cordite stinging the throat as the empty casing clatters away. The shell streaks across the field and slams into the leading strange tank's frontal armor. Instead of the familiar flash and puff of smoke from a penetration, there is a bright spark, a harsh metallic clang that echoes back like someone striking an anvil. The tank doesn't slow. It doesn't even lurch. It just keeps coming. The loader is already ramming another round home, hands moving on reflex. Treffer! Someone shouts, hit. But the word feels different now, lighter, unsure. The gun barks again. Another impact. Another shower of sparks, another shrill whine as steel glances off angled armor. Through his sight, the gunner watches in disbelief as the shot bounces away into the distance. The range ticks down, 500 meters, 400. The unfamiliar tank's turret swings slightly, like an animal turning its head to look for the source of an annoyance rather than a threat. Inside that tank, a T-34, the world sounds and feels very different. The engine roars directly behind the crew, heat radiating into the cramped fighting compartment. The air is thick with diesel fumes and dust leaking through gaps in the hatches. When the German shells hit, the impacts ring through the hull like a hammer blow on thick metal, a deep, booming clang that makes the walls vibrate and dust shake down from every crevice. You can imagine the crew flinching at the first strike, eyes darting instinctively to the armor plates around them, waiting for the telltale, white-hot lance of a penetration that never comes. Instead, they feel only the shudder of a solid hit that fails to get through. The commander, peering through his optics, spots the muzzle flash of the German gun. He gives a short order, voice raised over the engine and the rattle of loose equipment. The driver presses on, hands locked on the levers as the T-34 plows forward, its wide tracks grinding over furrows and low obstacles. The gunner swings the 76.2 mm gun, adjusting elevation with quick, precise movements. A Soviet loader shoulders a heavy shell up into the breech, metal scraping metal. When the gun fires, the whole turret kicks, smoke blooming in the confined space, the blast punching into the chests of the crew. Out ahead, the German position disappears in a burst of earth and splintered wood as the high-explosive round lands close. Back at the Pak gun, the effect is immediate. The crew, half deafened by their own firing, suddenly finds itself showered with dirt and debris as the T-34's shell detonates near their emplacement. The shield of the gun rings. Fragments whine through the air. One man throws himself flat, another raises an arm to protect his face, feeling the sting of flying splinters. For a moment, the gun falls silent. Then the shouting starts anew. Somebody orders them to keep firing, to aim lower, to go for the tracks. The loader scrambles to his feet, shoving another round into the breech with shaking hands. But each time the gun roars, the result is the same. Sparks, dust, no penetration. The tank absorbs the hits, its sloped armor turning shot after shot into nothing. This is not an isolated duel. Along stretches of the front, similar scenes play out. German anti-tank guns open fire at what they think are ordinary targets, only to find their rounds skidding away like pebbles off a boulder. Some crews switch to armor-piercing ammunition, then to high explosive out of desperation, trying anything that might slow these new machines. A few guns manage to damage tracks or smash external fittings, buying precious seconds. Others are simply overrun as the tanks press on, their tracks grinding past shattered carriages and abandoned positions, the smell of burnt paint and churned earth hanging heavy in the air. German tankers encounter the T-34 as well. In one account, a Panzer III commander sees an unfamiliar silhouette through swirling smoke. Low, angular, with a turret that seems to blend into the hull. He orders his gunner to fire. The 50mm round slams into the Soviet tank's front, only to ricochet away in a spray of sparks. You can picture the crew exchanging disbelieving glances in the dim, greenish light inside their turret. They fire again. Another bounce. Suddenly, incoming fire answers, an explosive hammer blow as a 76.2mm shell strikes their own armor. Even if it doesn't penetrate, the concussion rattles every bolt, fills the compartment with dust and the sharp tang of hot metal. Against a skilled T-34 crew at the right range, the duel is no longer one-sided. By some German reports, it takes multiple guns firing simultaneously at close distance to bring one of these tanks down. Shell after shell slams into the front and sides, leaving deep scars and craters in the armor. The noise becomes almost continuous, like a drum roll, each hit blending into the next. Still, the tank grinds forward. Smoke trailing from its engine deck, its gun still firing sporadically, its tracks chewing up the ground. Only when a lucky shot jams a track, or an impact finds a weaker spot on the side, does it finally lurch to a halt. Even then, some crews swear they see the turret continue to move, the machine refusing to die. The psychological effect is immense. After such engagements, surviving German gunners and infantry gather in shallow trenches or behind battered walls, voices low and tense. They talk about shells that simply bounced off, about monsters that shrugged off their best shots and had to be attacked from point-blank range, from below, from behind. One man describes aiming at a T-34's turret ring, hoping to jam it. Another talks about firing at the tracks and then watching in horror as the tank kept moving anyway. The familiar comforting math of armor thickness versus penetration tables suddenly feels meaningless. These stories travel quickly up the chain of command. In regimental and divisional headquarters, officers leaf through after-action reports filled with phrases that disturb their peace of mind. Unidentified heavy tanks, our 3.7cm guns ineffective at normal ranges, tank immune from the front. At first, some chalk it up to battlefield nerves, to misidentification, to the confusion of combat. But as similar descriptions arrive from different sectors, different units, different days, same basic pattern, the picture becomes harder to ignore. Intelligence officers begin to sketch rough diagrams based on witness accounts. Sloped front, wide tracks, turret ring set well back. A new Soviet tank type is acknowledged, even if its numbers and exact characteristics remain uncertain. On the Soviet side, the experience is equally intense, but colored by a different emotion. T-34 crews who survive these early clashes emerge shaken yet emboldened. Many have gone into battle with little idea of what their new machines could really withstand. Under fire, they have heard the impacts, felt the hull shudder, smelled insulation and dust knocked loose by each strike. They know how close death can be inside a tank when armor fails. When it doesn't, when the shells bounce away and the engine keeps pulling them forward, a grim kind of confidence blooms. You can imagine a driver stepping out of his tank after the battle, running his hand over fresh scars and gouges in the armor, and realizing that each mark could have been his grave in an older machine. None of this means the T-34 is invincible. Mechanical failures still claim many vehicles. Aircraft bombs and heavy guns can tear them apart. Poor coordination and leadership lead others into ambushes they cannot escape. Some are abandoned for lack of fuel or spares, their crews ordered to withdraw on foot. But in the narrow band of circumstances where a well-driven T-34 meets standard German anti-tank weapons head-on, the balance is unexpectedly tilted. The myth of absolute German technical superiority, nurtured by swift victories in the West, takes a serious blow. In the weeks that follow, the German advance continues, but the tone in certain reports changes. Field commanders begin to complain that their existing guns are inadequate against the new Soviet medium tanks. Requests for heavier weapons grow more urgent. Training directives caution troops about engaging heavily armored enemy tanks from the front. There is talk, sometimes half-joking and sometimes deadly serious, of door-knocker guns that only annoy the enemy. In private, some officers admit that they have underestimated Soviet industry and design. For a moment in the summer of 1941, the battlefield has shown the limits of planning and doctrine. A tank conceived in Kharkov's smoke-filled workshops and tested on frozen proving grounds has met the enemy it was built to fight. The result is written not just in destroyed vehicles and lost positions, but in the shaken confidence of an army that thought it understood the rules of armored warfare. Faced with a machine that can take everything they are currently throwing at it and keep moving, German commanders are forced into a hard truth. If they want to regain the initiative, they will have to find new ways to kill it, and fast. The search for those solutions, born out of shock and necessity, will drive the next phase of the fighting. As improvisation and desperation push men and machines to their limits. By late summer 1941, the shock of first contact has settled into something colder and more dangerous. A problem that will not go away. German commanders can no longer dismiss the new Soviet tanks as isolated curiosities. Reports of T-34s and heavy KVs appear too often from too many sectors. The frontline troops know it first. In battered farmhouses turned into command posts, the air thick with tobacco smoke and sweat, platoon and company leaders lean over rough maps, listening as shaken gunners explain how their shells bounced off angled armor at 50 meters. The old assumptions about what a medium tank should be able to withstand have been broken in a matter of weeks. The first answer is brutally simple. If the regular anti-tank guns cannot kill it from the front, bring in something that can. That means the 8.8 cm flak guns, towering, complex weapons originally designed to punch holes in high-flying bombers. Now, under pressure, they are dragged forward into direct fire against armor. You can picture the scene. A dusty field outside a village, horse teams, and half-tracks straining as they haul an 88 into position, its long barrels swinging slowly down from the sky to the horizon. The crew works fast, sweat running into their eyes, hands blackened with grease and dust. They know that once they open fire, they will be a priority target for every enemy gun within range. When the T-34s appear, the difference is immediate. The first 88mm armor-piercing round slams into a Soviet tank at several hundred meters with a deep, catastrophic impact. Instead of sparks and ricochets, there is a violent spray of debris, smoke jetting from the hole torn in the armor. To the German gunners, the sense of relief is almost physical. At last, here is a weapon that restores some of the old equations. But the cost of using it this way is high. These big guns are hard to conceal, slow to move, vulnerable to artillery and air attack. Each time they are deployed forward, crews know they are gambling their lives to plug gaps in a system that was never designed with the T-34 in mind. Elsewhere, improvisation takes a more intimate and terrifying form. Infantry and combat engineers are told that if guns can't stop the new tanks at range, they must disable them up close. New instructions emphasize attacking tracks, idler wheels, and engine decks with explosives. Men are trained, sometimes only briefly, in how to crawl toward a moving tank, staying in its blind spots, using ditches and shell holes for cover. You can almost feel the cold mud soaking through their uniforms as they press themselves into the earth, hearing the tracks clatter closer, the stink of exhaust and hot metal growing stronger with every second. At the last moment, they dash forward to slap a charge onto steel or wedge a mine under a track, then throw themselves away from the blast and hope they've judged the distance right. Some accounts describe infantry bundling grenades together with wire, creating crude but powerful charges they can stuff into tracks or under overhanging armor. Others talk about using satchel charges placed at the corners of buildings or in culverts to catch tanks as they pass. None of this is clean or controlled. It is desperate, close-range work, carried out under the grinding noise and suffocating presence of machines that many soldiers have come to fear. Every success is paid for in blood. Every failure leaves crushed bodies and a tank that keeps rolling. Panzer crews are forced to rethink their own tactics as well. The days of confidently dueling most enemy tanks from the front are fading. Training now emphasizes maneuver, not just firepower. A Panzer III commander, seeing T-34s ahead, orders smoke rounds to screen his unit as they swing wide through a patch of woods or along a gully, seeking a chance to hit from the side or rear. Radios crackle with new urgency as platoons coordinate flanking moves, trying to pin Soviet tanks with one element while another sneaks into a better position. When a side shot connects and disables a T-34, the relief inside the German turret is palpable. Shouted curses, thumps on the gunner's shoulder, the tension bleeding out in a rush. But everyone knows that a single mistake, a stalled engine, a misjudged turn, can flip the balance instantly. In the rear areas, field workshops and depots become laboratories of improvisation. Mechanics weld extra plates of salvaged armor onto the fronts of guns and vehicles, experimenting with crude appliqué protection. Crews scrounge for captured Soviet ammunition and try to figure out whether any of it can be turned back against its makers. New types of armor-piercing rounds, including high-velocity tungsten cores, are issued in small quantities to frontline units, carefully rationed and reserved for the toughest targets. You can imagine a gun commander counting his remaining special shells, fingers tracing the stamped markings on each casing before loading one with deliberate care when a T-34 breaks through the haze. Doctrine struggles to keep pace, and training pamphlets and field manuals are updated on the fly, with mimeographed sheets slipped into binders or pasted over old diagrams. They show the vulnerabilities of the new Soviet tanks as understood at the time. Thinner armor at the rear, weaker spots around the turret ring, the possibility of jamming tracks or damaging suspension components. Briefings emphasize camouflage, ambush positions, and letting T-34s come close enough for side shots before opening fire, a suggestion that demands a level of discipline under pressure that not every unit can muster. In short, what used to be a straightforward contest of gun versus armor is becoming a chess match played at full speed, under fire. Above the regimental and divisional level, the scale of the problem is clearer still. Staff officers collate reports from army groups spread across the vast Eastern Front. Patterns emerge. Standard 3.7 cm guns consistently underperform against T-34s and heavy tanks. 5 cm weapons are better, but still unreliable at longer ranges. Only larger calibers like the 88 and some heavy field guns offer consistent front-on kills. The conclusion is impossible to avoid. If the German army wants to meet this new threat without constantly improvising under fire, it needs a new generation of anti-tank weapons and armored vehicles. In meeting rooms lit by shaded lamps, amid clinking coffee cups and rustling paper, the outlines of future guns and tanks take shape. Heavier, more powerful, more complex. Yet those future solutions are still months or years away. In the meantime, the burden falls on the men already at the front. Their days are a mix of long stretches of exhaustion and sudden flashes of terror, waiting in shallow pits beside quiet fields, listening for distant engines, jolting awake as an alarm sends them scrambling to their guns, feeling the ground tremble as Soviet armor approaches. They learn to read tiny signs, the way birds suddenly take flight, the faint smell of fuel on the wind, the way a distant line of trees seems to shift as something moves behind it. Each engagement with the new tanks is a test of nerve as much as skill. Over time, experience and improvisation begin to pay off. German units that survive multiple encounters with T-34s grow more adept at using terrain, coordinating fire, and exploiting weaknesses. Combined arms tactics, linking artillery, infantry, anti-tank guns, and panzers, offer a way to blunt Soviet tank attacks even when no single weapon is decisive. But the margins are thin, and the cost is high. Every improvised ambush that works is built on previous failures, on positions overrun, on gun crews silenced before they could adapt. The frontline soldiers know that they are living in the gap between two eras, the old world of armor they understood, and the new world that the T-34 has forced into being. Behind them, in factories and design offices far from the front, engineers and planners are already translating these bloody lessons into steel, new guns, new ammunition, new tanks meant to reassert German dominance on the battlefield. For now, though, Those answers exist mostly as sketches, prototypes, and plans. On the Eastern Front, the men with dirt under their nails and ringing in their ears must keep fighting with what they have, making up solutions day by day, hoping they can hold the line until something better arrives. Soon that something better will begin to roll off production lines on both sides of the war, as the shock of 1941 hardens into a full-scale industrial arms race between two very different visions of armored warfare. By the winter of 1941-42, the Eastern Front has become a landscape of wrecks. Burned-out tanks lie half-buried in snow and mud, their turrets blown open, their hulls tilted at silent angles. Some are German, some Soviet, some so mangled that only careful inspection can tell who built them. Each wreck is a frozen argument between armor and firepower, a mute record of what worked and what failed. As commanders on both sides study these hulks, a realization hardens. The war in the East will not be won by tactics alone. It is becoming a test of steel, factories, and design. In German staff headquarters, far from the frontline trenches, officers spread photographs and reports across tables. Here is a T-34, its sloped front still intact despite dozens of visible hits. Here is a KV heavy tank, finally brought down only after an 88mm gun was brought forward at great risk. Next to them are images of knocked-out Panzer IIIs and IVs, their flat plates punched through by Soviet 76.2mm shells. Engineers and ordnance experts run their fingers along lines on blueprints, tracing armor thicknesses and impact angles. Conversations shift from confidence to concern. The question is no longer whether the T-34 is dangerous, it clearly is, but how quickly Germany can answer it in kind. The first tangible outcome is in artillery and anti-tank design. Work that had begun before the war on heavier guns is suddenly given top priority. The 7.5cm Pak-40, a powerful anti-tank gun, is rushed from design boards into production lines. You can imagine the factory halls where this happens. The clatter of presses stamping out carriages, the shriek of lathes turning solid steel into precise rifled barrels, the smell of hot cutting oil hanging over rows of workers. Each completed gun is a promise, a way to punch through armor that only months before seemed untouchable. But every extra centimeter of steel, every kilogram of metal, is also a strain on Germany's limited resources. At the same time, German tank designers take a hard look at their existing armored forces. The Panzer III and early Panzer IV, once considered cutting-edge, are now shown to be inadequate against well-handled T-34s. Meetings at firms like MAN and Daimler-Benz become tense as army requirements grow more demanding. The generals want thicker armor, better guns, and improved mobility all at once. Out of these demands will emerge new designs, most famously the Panther, an attempt to merge German engineering with lessons drawn from the T-34's sloped armor and battlefield performance. On paper, the Panther promises to restore the balance. A powerful 75mm high-velocity gun, angled plates, and good cross-country ability. But engineering ambition comes with a price. German designers push for complex suspensions, advanced optics, intricate transmissions, features that make their tanks deadly on the battlefield, but hard to build and maintain in huge numbers. You can almost see the arguments unfold across cluttered desks. Officers urging speed and quantity, engineers warning that shortcuts will lead to breakdowns, factory managers wondering where they will find the skilled hands for such demanding work. While prototypes are tested on proving grounds, frontline crews are still fighting in older machines, waiting for reinforcements that feel like they will never arrive soon enough. On the Soviet side, the response to the early months of the war is just as intense, but shaped by a different philosophy. The T-34 has proven itself in combat, but the Red Army knows its flaws all too well. Crews complain about cramped interiors, poor visibility, unreliable transmissions, and early breakdowns. Factory engineers sift through mountains of reports, listening to survivors describe jammed hatches, stiff controls, and guns that lose accuracy after long marches. Instead of redesigning the entire tank from scratch, Soviet planners focus on steady refinement, and above all, mass production. Evacuated factories, torn down piece by piece as the Germans advanced in 1941, are rebuilt deep in the Soviet interior. In places like Nizhny Tagil, new tank plants rise alongside rail lines, their concrete still curing as assembly jigs are bolted to the floor. The conditions are harsh. Workers sleep in barracks or even in the factories themselves, wrapped in coats against the cold. Machines freeze, power flickers, tools are scarce. Yet under that pressure, techniques are simplified, parts standardized, assembly lines streamlined. The goal is simple: more T-34s, built faster, with enough quality to fight and survive. Small improvements accumulate. The turret is redesigned from a 2-man to a 3-man arrangement in many models, easing the commander's burden. Optics are improved where possible. Armor is adjusted to balance protection and production speed. Welding techniques are refined to reduce weak seams. You can picture a Soviet supervisor walking along a line of half-finished hulls checking welds with a practiced eye, knowing that every minute saved in fabrication might mean another tank on the front line when the next German offensive begins. The contrast between the two approaches sharpens as the war goes on. Germany, with a smaller industrial base and fewer raw materials, pours effort into highly capable but complex designs. The Panther, the Tiger, new self-propelled guns. Each is formidable, but each also demands time, skilled labor, and meticulous maintenance. The Soviet Union, absorbing terrible losses and operating under relentless strain, doubles down on functional simplicity. The T-34 is not elegant, but it can be built in vast numbers, repaired with basic tools, and handed to crews with limited training. In every T-34 that rolls out of a factory gate, you can feel the compromise between what would be ideal and what is possible under fire. Meanwhile, both sides race to improve their ammunition. German designers work on better armor-piercing rounds, including those with cores of rare metals designed to punch through heavy armor at long range. Soviet engineers refine shell designs for the 76.2mm gun and later introduce new calibers to deal with German heavy tanks. Each new projectile is tested on captured or damaged armor plates, the results measured in penetration depths and fracture patterns, and, ultimately, in the number of burning vehicles left behind on the field. The science of killing tanks becomes colder, more precise, and more brutal. All of this plays out over and through the lives of ordinary soldiers. For a German anti-tank gunner, the arrival of a Par 40 in his unit means a tangible change in his chances of survival. He can now knock out T-34s at ranges where his old door-knocker gun was little more than a noisemaker. For a Soviet tanker, climbing into a slightly improved T-34 with better armor seams and more reliable components means a small but real increase in the odds that his machine will bring him home. You can almost hear the difference in their voices when they talk about their equipment. Less fatalism, a little more hope. By 1943, the arms race on the Eastern Front is obvious to anyone watching. At Kursk, hundreds of German Panthers and Tigers drive into battle against waves of T-34s and other Soviet tanks, the air filled with the roar of engines, the crack of guns, and the howl of incoming artillery. Every vehicle, every gun, is the product of decisions made years or months earlier in design offices and factories. Some perform as promised, others break down or burn under fire. The duel is no longer just Panzer versus T-34. It is assembly line versus assembly line, engineer versus engineer, ideology versus ideology, all expressed in armor thickness, gun velocity, and production quotas. Yet for all the talk of calibers and armor layouts, the war remains fundamentally human. Inside every tank, men sit cramped in steel shells, blind outside their narrow viewports, trusting that the people who designed and built their machines have not failed them. On both sides, crews develop rituals, tapping the armor for luck, stowing personal talismans in corners of the turret, muttering quiet prayers as the engine revs up before an attack. The arms race has reshaped the battlefield, but it is the people inside the steel who must live with the consequences of each new design. And as the machines grow heavier and more lethal, the stories those men tell about them begin to drift away from raw technical data and into something else: fear, pride, hatred, respect. What began as an industrial contest is slowly turning into legend, written not only in blueprints and production figures, but in the memories of those who survived the fire. For the men on the ground, the T-34 is never just a set of specifications on a page. It is sound, weight, vibration, and fear. To a German infantryman in 1941 or 1942, the first sign is often a distant rumble, a low growl that rises and falls as engines climb through gears. You can almost feel it through your boots before you see anything. Earth trembling very slightly, loose dirt on the trench wall shivering. Then through smoke and dust, a shape begins to form. Low, angular, sloped, the tracks kicking up clods of mud. Someone whispers, half in anger and half in dread, "T-34!" And every man along the line knows that the next minute will be a test of nerve. The noise when it closes in is overwhelming. The engine roars, gears whine, the tracks clatter and clank over stones, timber, and sometimes the wreckage of other vehicles. Shells from light guns thud into its armor with a hollow, mocking sound, like fists pounding on a locked door. You can imagine a German soldier pressed into the bottom of a trench, fingers digging into the cold earth as the tank passes directly overhead, dirt raining down onto his helmet, the underside of the hull scraping past just an arm's length above. He smells hot oil, scorched paint, and the bitter stench of exhaust. In those seconds, the T-34 is not an enemy vehicle. It is a moving wall, a force of nature. Inside the Soviet tank, the picture is different but no less intense. 4 or 5 men are crammed into a space barely big enough for them and their equipment. The floor vibrates constantly. The driver squints through a small vision slit, his world reduced to a strip of road and obstacles. The gunner stares into his sight, adjusting for range and movement. The loader feeds shell after shell into the gun, muscles burning, hands slick with sweat even in winter. The commander tries to do a dozen things at once: watch for threats, listen to orders over a crackling radio, if they have one, and shout instructions over the noise. When German fire hits, each impact slams through the hull like a hammer. Dust and rust flakes fall from above. For a moment, everyone holds their breath, waiting to feel if the hit has gone through. Some Soviet veterans later describe the strange mix of terror and pride that comes from seeing their tanks marked and scarred, but still alive. After a battle, when the engine is finally shut down and the silence feels almost unnatural, they climb out and walk around their machines, tracing new impact marks with gloved fingers. Here, a groove where a shell has ricocheted. There, a crater where the armor held. Every scar is a reminder of how close they came, and of what their tank absorbed for them. You can almost hear the edge in their voices as they tell each other, "They shot, and it did nothing." Half boasting, half trying to convince themselves that the next time will be the same. On the German side, the stories sound different but share the same sense of awe. Infantrymen talk about unloading entire belts of machine gun ammunition into a T-34S front with no visible effect, the bullets sparking off like rain on stone. Anti-tank gunners remember watching their rounds bounce away, feeling an almost physical shock as years of training and trust in their weapons seem to dissolve in a few seconds. Around campfires and in dugouts, rumors grow with each retelling. Tanks that shrugged off a dozen hits, tanks that drove on with flames licking at their engine decks, tanks that only stopped when the crew was killed by a lucky shot into a hatch. Even when exaggeration creeps in, the core emotion is real, respect tinged with fear. These stories travel faster than official reports. New units arriving at the front hear about the T-34 long before they see it. A young replacement might listen in silence as older soldiers talk in low voices about those Russian tanks, about comrades crushed under tracks or blasted out of gun positions. No one quotes armor penetration tables. Instead, they talk about what it feels like to face one with nothing but a rifle, or to hear its engine in the dark while lying wounded in a field. By the time that replacement actually sees a T-34 cresting a ridge, the silhouette is already loaded with meaning. It is not just a vehicle, it is the embodiment of everything they have been warned about in the East. For Soviet crews, the myth runs in the opposite direction. Propaganda posters and newsreels celebrate the T-34 as a symbol of national strength, showing it smashing through enemy lines, draped in flags, cheered by liberated civilians. Inside the tank, the reality is harsher. Breakdowns, cramped conditions, poor visibility, the constant risk of being caught by heavy guns or aircraft. Yet even knowing these things, many tankers develop a fierce attachment to their machines. They paint names on the armor, for Moscow, for the motherland, for Ivan in memory of a lost friend. They sleep against the hull in freezing bivouacs, trusting that the same steel that shields them in battle will hold some warmth in the night. Not every encounter ends in the T-34's favor. There are Soviet crews who die without ever seeing the guns that kill them, tanks torn open by 88s, mines, or concentrated fire. Survivors talk about the suddenness of it. One moment, the world is noise and movement. The next, everything is smoke, flame, and choking fumes. Those who make it out carry their own kind of scars, burns, hearing damage, a lifetime of flinching at sudden loud sounds. For them, the myth of the invulnerable T-34 is something they know from the outside, from posters and speeches. They respect the tank's strengths, but they never forget how thin the line is between survival and being trapped inside a burning metal box. Over time, both sides begin to talk about the T-34 in language that is less technical and more personal. German veterans refer to it as a beast, a devil, a nightmare. Soviet veterans call it a friend, a savior, sometimes even a coffin on tracks, depending on how their luck held. You can hear in those words how the machine has escaped the control of the engineers who created it. It has become a character in the story of the war, with its own reputation, its own personality, relentless, stubborn, hard to stop. Even long after the war, memory continues to smooth out the details and sharpen the emotions. In interviews and memoirs, German survivors often describe their first sight of a T-34 with the same vivid clarity they reserve for the worst days of their lives. Soviet tankers, old men now, sit in front of cameras and talk about the warmth of the engine in winter, the taste of dust in their mouths, the way the hull rang when hit. They argue over how many enemy tanks they knocked out, over which model was better, over who really had the advantage. But beneath the arguments lies a shared understanding. The T-34 changed how they fought and how they felt in ways no one could have predicted before 1941. By then, the tank is no longer just steel and rivets. It is a memory, a symbol, and for many a ghost that still visits in dreams. The sound of tracks in the dark, the thud of a hit, the uncertain moment after when you wait to see whether the armor will hold. And as the guns fall silent and the wrecks rust away in empty fields, the question shifts from what the T-34 did in those few desperate years to what it will mean to the generations that only ever meet it in photographs, monuments, and stories told by men whose lives it spared or took. When the guns finally fall silent over Europe, the T-34 does not simply vanish with the smoke. It lingers in scrapyards and parades, in memories, and in the shape of the post-war world. On old battlefields from Ukraine to Poland, its hulks sit half-sunk in the earth, grass growing around twisted tracks, birds nesting in empty turrets. Children climb over the rusting steel without knowing that once, men crouched inside the same cramped space, listening for the next incoming shell. The tank that seemed unstoppable in 1941 is now just another relic, but the mark it left on the war is carved deep into history. In the years immediately after 1945, the T-34 becomes a symbol of victory for the Soviet Union. Freshly painted tanks rumble through Red Square on parade days, their crews sitting high in open hatches, flags snapping above them. You can almost hear the echo of their engines bouncing off the stone buildings, the cheers of crowds packed shoulder to shoulder along the route. For many citizens, the sight is reassuring. Proof that the state which bled so heavily has not only survived, but emerged with a weapon the world has learned to respect. Statues and monuments follow, T-34s perched on concrete plinths at crossroads and in town squares, their guns pointed toward a vanquished enemy that will never return. At the same time, historians and officers begin to dissect the tank's real impact. In dimly lit offices lined with files, they argue over numbers. How many were built, how many were destroyed, how many German tanks they took with them. Some documents credit the T-34 with turning the tide in the East almost single-handedly. Others take a more cautious view, pointing out the decisive roles of artillery, infantry, logistics, and the sheer weight of Soviet manpower. You can picture a veteran colonel tapping a report with his finger, insisting that no tank, no matter how good, wins a war alone. The truth lies somewhere between legend and ledger. On the German side, the T-34 continues to haunt post-war conversations. Former officers write memoirs, sitting at desks in quiet rooms far from the fields where they once fought. When they reach the chapters about 1941 and 1942, the tone changes. They describe the first encounters with the new Soviet tanks with a vividness that time has not dulled. Shells bouncing from sloped armor, desperate calls for 88s, attacks stalled in fields they thought they could cross in hours. Some emphasize logistics and strategy, explaining their defeat in terms of fuel, weather, and numbers. Others return again and again to the shock of realizing that the enemy had built a tank that could shrug off weapons they had trusted with their lives. As the Cold War begins, the T-34 spreads far beyond the old battle lines. Shipments of surplus tanks roll out of Soviet factories and depots, bound for allies and client states. T-34s appear in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, sometimes facing Western-built tanks, sometimes fighting each other in wars that have little to do with the Eastern Front, but everything to do with the new global struggle. Photographs show the same familiar silhouette against very different skies. Desert heat haze instead of Russian snow, jungle hills instead of Ukrainian plains. The tank's life extends for decades beyond the war it was designed for, its reputation traveling with it into conflicts its creators never imagined. Yet even as its legend grows, a quieter reassessment is underway. Engineers and military historians pick apart its strengths and weaknesses with cool eyes. They praise its sloped armor, wide tracks, and powerful gun for 1941. But note its crude finish, unreliable early transmissions, and poor crew ergonomics. They compare it to later designs that outclass it in almost every technical metric. In classrooms and staff colleges, officers learn that the T-34 was brilliant for its time, but not magic. That it gained much of its power from being in the right place, in the right numbers, at a moment when its enemies were unprepared. For the men who actually served with or against it, the debates can feel distant. A Soviet veteran visiting a museum in his old age might stand before a preserved T-34 and run his hand along the armor, feeling old scars under fresh paint. He remembers the noise, the heat, the fear, and the moments of impossible relief when hits bounced away. A former German gunner, seeing the same tank, might feel an old weight settle in his chest, recalling the first time he watched his rounds spark harmlessly off a moving target. Their memories do not always match the historian's charts, but they carry a truth of their own. In the end, the T-34's legacy is not just technical or tactical, it is a reminder of how quickly war can punish complacency. In 1941, German forces entered the Soviet Union convinced that their weapons and doctrine were enough. The appearance of a tank that took everything they threw at it and just kept going forced them to admit that the enemy could innovate too, and that their own assumptions could be deadly. The arms race that followed reshaped both armies, drove industry to its limits, and filled battlefields with newer, deadlier machines. Today, when you see a T-34 on a pedestal, its paint bright and its barrel clean, it is easy to forget the chaos and terror that once followed wherever it went. The engine is silent, the tracks are fixed in place, and the steel is cold. Yet if you look closely at the scars still visible beneath the restoration, you can read a different story. Of an idea drawn on paper in Kharkov, hammered into reality under brutal conditions, and then tested against fire and disbelief on the widest front the world has ever seen. For a brief, crucial moment in that war, this tank forced an army that thought itself invincible to confront its limits, and in doing so, it helped shape the outcome of the struggle that defined the 20th century.